Hello and welcome to this, the last in the summer series of webinars from Ecology. I'm Chris, I'm the comms lead at Ecology, and today's session is going to be hosted by, presented by Matthew Powell. He is our Nature Recovery Project Manager at Ecology and he's our peatland specialist. Matt previously worked at Natural England as a protected site senior advisor, and he is a massive nerd about peatland, which is fantastic because I love speaking to him about peatland. He always comes out with some really interesting anecdotes or some kind of facts, and having a conversation with him about peatland is just a joy. So you're in for a treat today. We've seen there's over 190 of you have signed up, so hoping to see lots of you turning up today. I'm going to hand over to Matt now, leave you in his capable hands. So Matt, here you go.
Hey Chris, thanks for that, and thanks for the lift music as well, much appreciated to begin with. Yeah, it might have oversold me a little bit, but let's go from there. So yeah, here we are. So what I was thinking about doing today was that we'll have a bit of a discussion about peat, whether our peat's the same, what's gone wrong with our peat. Nothing's really gone wrong with the peat, but it's more gone wrong with the peatlands. And then how do we fettle it? How do we get it better? This is more of a foray through my personal experience and thoughts on the subject. It's not necessarily Ecology's thoughts on the subject themselves, but yeah, I just thought I'd just try and share a little bit of my tiny little bit of wisdom. So, as Chris had said, I'm Matt Powell. I'm the Nature Recovery Project Manager. I've been at Ecology since October. Prior to that, I'd spent a long time at Natural England, started off as a lead advisor in the Lake District team, and then latterly I was in the National Protected Sites team, pontificating on all things to do with Section 28 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act and Agricultural EIA. Whilst I was in the Lake District team, well, there's quite a lot of peat up here, quite a lot of wet stuff, so that's where I ended up cutting my teeth, ended up doing quite a lot of stuff on, quite a few of the raised mires in the area, quite a lot of the upland fens and my wetland systems, and also for my sins as well, I was also involved on the countryside stewardship options panel. So when countryside stewardship was being developed, I'm one of the unfortunate souls that have written some of those prescriptions, and I will say that those prescriptions started off really, really good, and apologies that they probably got a little bit watered down, as things have to be verifiable apparently. So you can't just have things that will actually deliver stuff on the ground, which is pretty unfortunate. But yeah, so that's me. That is me actually as well. I was doing some monitoring up on Devitt Water in the Lake District, and we found a nice big lump of Nitella flexilis, and the obvious thing to do was to wear it on the head. But anyhow, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. So what is peat? There's various different definitions of what peat is. A lot of them pertain to, how carbon rich the soil is, the organic matter that you find within it. But peat's been around for a long, long time. We've got massive coal beds. They started off as peat, from the Carboniferous period, and they've been incredibly important to climate change ever since peat layers started to come about. Right at the start, back in that Carboniferous period, where you've got the really big peat beds nowadays, you've got coal beds even, until fungi had learned to actually decompose lignin. So we had a lot of trees, and until fungi had learned how to decompose it, organic matter built up and up and up, and that stripped carbon out of the atmosphere. And then all of a sudden, it induced climate change, but not in the way that we know it today. It started to make things colder, and it wasn't until that stuff started to decompose, or some parts of it did start to get decomposed, that we started to get a little bit more release of carbon into the atmosphere. So it's a really potent tool for managing the climate, and particularly if we're wanging out CO2 left, right, and centre as we are, then we need to just try and find ways of trying to get nature to help us a little bit. The image there is actually a bit of peat that myself and my colleague Olivia unearthed a few months ago back in the Lake District, I think it was, right down at the bottom of a 140 centimetre peat depth of peat. And what was just so amazing was just the fact that the clarity of the seeds that were still in there, etc. It's probably sedge peat, probably dating back, I would say, about 7,000 years, something like that in that location. It was, yeah, it's quite special stuff. I've actually got some of those seeds in a little pot at home, here at home, just seeing whether they'll still germinate. I mean, it's a long shot, but let's see. So the problem with a lot of our definitions, though, is that they've got caveats, and the main caveat that we have today is down to the depth. So peat isn't peat, so people will say it's a peaty soil if it's anything less than 50 centimeters or 30 centimeters deep. And you know, as I say there, it depends on where you stood, what the time is, and who lobbied for what. It's a very cynical view, I know, but the fact of the matter for me is that peat is peat. It doesn't matter whether it's deep or whether it's not deep. Shallow peat is the deep peat of the future, and I'll repeat this right the way through this presentation. And that when you try and define something by a single characteristic, it doesn't actually take into account everything that goes with it. So, you know, the biodiversity on a shallow bit of peat is exactly the same as what you would find on a deep. The other thing about it as well is that the depth of the peat doesn't actually let you know, if you're defining stuff by the depth of its peat, then you're not actually defining it by the natural processes that help create those peatlands. But we'll come back to that later, because, you know, it's a very key part to the later part of my of the talk. And there's Liv looking pretty sad that all we'd found on this wet site was very, very shallow peat. So our wet bits, where are they? They're typically up north and to the west of the country. They're typically found in that wetter, cooler and higher, better parts of the country, although you do get some pretty extensive bits down south in the around Dartmoor, Exmoor, Bodmin, etc., and then obviously around the Broads and Lincolnshire, etc. I think what you'll also notice here from this map from Cranfield University is that if you look at the distribution of peat, there's far more shallow peat than there is deep peat. So if we're talking about, just as I was just mentioning just before, that if you're defining stuff by the depth of it, then are we going to be fundamentally missing a trick? So types of peat. There's two different types to my knowledge. There might be more out there to people with bigger, more complex brains than I've got. But yeah, the two main types that we have are ombrotrophic peat and minotrophic peat. So ombrotrophic peat is, you know, it's precipitation fed. So that's where it gets all its water, it's where it gets all its nutrients. So it's incredibly low nutrient, typically acidic. It's mainly found in the wetter north. You know, there are sites down in the Somerset Levels, probably down in Humberside, and I would say probably down in the Dartmoor, Exmoor area as well, that are ombrotrophic in nature. But, you know, the vast big complexes of your ombrotrophic peat are up north. And then you've got your minotrophic peat. So that's pretty much everything else, and it's rain and groundwater fed, so it has higher nutrients, and it's typically found anywhere that is wet enough to retard the decomposition of that organic matter that builds up. What we're really fortunate to have in this country as well is that we have sites which have the mixture of these two. So, for instance, Burnsbeck Moss in South Cumbria is a lot of my references will be Cumbrian in origin. So I'm Cumbrian born and bred. So, yeah, I will speak about the motherland quite often. And then, yeah, the Burnsbeck Moss, it's great. It's got ombrotrophic lenses within a minotrophic valley mire system. It's absolutely fantastic. So if you are ever in the sort of like southeast of Cumbria, it's a CWT, Cumbria Wildlife Trust reserve. Yeah, go and visit it and give them some cash while you are, because they need it to help protect these sites. So yeah, ombrotrophic peat. Let's have a bit of a delve into that. As I said, most of our ombrotrophic peat is found in the north of the country, and it does tend to form our big landscape peats as blanket bog and raised mires. And of our peats, it actually forms the climax community forms a climax community. So as soon as it's established, you wouldn't really expect anything else to get there unless there's something serious happens to it. But it's also suffered probably the most out of particularly lowland res Myers. You know, that 96% of them have been lost. It's amazing to think of their spread and where they actually were and where there's just absolutely no hint of them now. So, you know, the flatland to the north of Liverpool, anywhere like most of the Fylde, for instance, like it's completely gone. It's all grass, it's all crops now. Around Lincolnshire, etc. It's probably likely that was all res Meyer complexes as well. And you know, by virtue of it being peat, you know, it is our most productive agricultural land. You know, is on these areas of loss, which is something we'll come and cover a bit later on as well. So yeah, then we'll drop onto minotrophic peat. So as I said, you know, this is everything else, and it quite often manifests itself, particularly from my experience, as valley and basin Myers. But it also includes reed swamps, transition mires, quaking bogs, which are incredibly fun to go and have a play on, flushes, sumps, you name it. And it differs from unintended peat by having groundwater, and therefore that nutrient input is different. It's higher, but equally it can be just as low. You know, in somewhere which has got it's quite acidic geology, etc., quite low nutrient rich geology. Those peats and those communities will be exactly the same as, say, an unintended peatland. But yeah, where you do get some like calcium flushing through, etc., then you also get really, really rich assemblages. I think this is a bit of quite species rich reed bed down in Somerset Levels. I've travelled far and wide. So yeah, res Myers. So this is basically the type of peat that I've very much spent a lot of time stomping over, falling in, etc. And they're typically found anywhere where the peat's allowed to accumulate over time. We find them in the lowlands and also on valley Myers, and you also get lenses on blanket bogs. And they defy gravity. They are absolutely wonderful and amazing things. So you can have a res Meyer which is 5, 6, 7 meters above the antecedent ground level. And that ground level around it will be dry, you know, it's heavily drained or whatever now. But you walk onto the bog and it is sopping, and it's just they do it through the medium and the magic of sphagnum. Sphagnum's just incredibly well designed, or evolved, I should say, not designed, and to keep hold of water. You know, it's a keystone species. It's just as good as us, if not better, at creating conditions that are absolutely perfect for itself, at the expense of near enough everything else. And bogs have a structure to them. You know, that's one of the wonderful things as well. You know, you look at a bog and you just think, oh, that's, you know, just a big dome of peat. But, you know, they have these two layers. They have the acrotome, which is the living layer. It's the active layer. It's the area which is actively accreting peat. But that will only be about 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters deep at max. And that's just basically built up of the living parts of the sphagnum and the other vegetation that's living on there. And then you have the storage department, the grand warehouse, the catatown. You know, that's where all the peat that's slowly but surely becoming more humified. It's incredibly wet. It's almost becoming clay-like in some of its properties, which is just really interesting. It's really key actually to helping us understand some of the ways that we can actually help restore bogs after we've been in and messed with them. But as I've said, you know, the sphagnum really is the star of the show. It's one of these places where one of these things that when you start delving into the actual physiology of sphagnum, right, the way that it can fire off hydrogen ions to attract any sort of like ions of nutrient into it, therefore acidifying the water around it. You know, like almost like using chemical processes like that. It's just absolutely stunning, really, and the fact that it just stays wet for so long as well, even during the summer. So then, yeah, we'll move on to blanket bogs. So blanket bogs are much more extensive versions of your res Myers, and you will get res Myers in amongst them. And these cover a hectare. You know, these are the landscapes of peat that you see typically up in the high north or on our upland sites. Sorry, the dog's not back in the room. And these are also like home to some of our rarest breeding birds, phalaropes, etc., that you find up in the far north. Don't find them really anywhere else. They won't breed anywhere else. Our divers, etc., you typically find them breeding on the pools that are in amongst the peatlands up there. And these are typically unitrophic in their nature, but they can also hold some minotrophic elements within them as well. So it's that whole mosaic and complex. And over the past 5,000 years, these have become the climax community over vast swathes of our northern areas of the country. There were trees. They went for whatever reason, whether that was man or whether that was because as the climate got colder and wetter, or warmer and wetter, depending on your viewpoint, it started to became the most perfect conditions for peat to actually start to form. So then, and we've got fens and swamps. This is everything else, as I said earlier. If it's wet, and it includes reed beds, valley mires, basin mires. Manchester, I was in Manchester over the weekend for the cricket, and I tell you what, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a fen growing on that cricket ground on Sunday. It was sopping. And they all have, in common, they have groundwater influence, which can lead to some really amazing plant communities. But as I said earlier, some are very, very simple, just like raised mires, unitrophic peat. My favourite type of fens, though, are calcareous fens. I've been fortunate enough to spend some time stomping around Anglesey, going over some of the fens down there, the calcareous fens down there. And they're just, they are magical. So you've got this complex of peat, and then you've got marl deposition, which is, chara. The charophytes that actually help that process are, the chara that you get there. Chara is a type of algae, and very much like sphagnum, it uses chemical processes. So the way that chara actually operates is it gets a lot of its carbon dioxide from calcium carbonate. So it basically splits the calcium carbonate into calcite and carbon dioxide, and then that calcite precipitates out, creating marl. So another, which is perfect for it. It just sort of like makes things a little bit more alkali, etc. And then you end up with these incredibly weird transitions whilst you're walking over these bogs, where you've got a lot of calcium-rich water and substrate melding into the acidic peat, and you just got weird and wonderful plant communities growing on it. Really exciting. And if you can get yourself to Anglesey to have a look at some of those calcareous fens, do so. I highly recommend it. So let's get to the business end then, really, about a lot of this. What went wrong? Well, we did. We've often treat our peatlands as a wasteland. Daniel Defoe said in the 1720s, and this is about chat moss, that basically it just looks, the peatland looks black and dirty and is frightful to think of, for it will bear neither horse, man, or etc. You can read that. I'm not going to insult your intelligence, but and this has been a common theme with regards to peatlands, is that they have always been derided. We think of it a bog, it's a morass, it's not a pleasant place. You're getting bogged down in things. It's never a good. I can't really think of any terms which are to do with bogs which are seemingly positive. And so in the interest of progress, we cut peat, we drained peat, we planted peat, we burnt peat, we poisoned peat. You name it, we've done it to it, and it's still here. It's clinging on in places. So I just want to do a little bit of a delve into some of the ways that we've actually affected peat. And first of all, I think we'll have a look at forestry. Yes. Okay, it probably wasn't Terry Wogan's fault, but he did help. So actually it was Sir John Maxwell's fault. As I said, Terry did help in a way. So from World War I onwards, we needed more trees. There was a vast shortage of timber within the country. So peat was then seen as fair game. People couldn't actually get the trees to grow in it, and then Sir John Maxwell did a lot of extensive work on working out how to plant trees and get them to grow successfully on the Carrara estate up in Scotland. Carrara estate today is probably home to one of the most amazing nature recovery projects around, and under the guidance of Sarah Watt and prior to that, it was a friend of mine, Alan McLeod, who was working up there as well. And yeah, they some of the work that they're doing is fantastic. But I mean, is it making up for some of the damage that was caused? Yeah, by this man and his quest to try and get trees to grow. And you know, this thing was taken up by a lot of people. You know, like the Forestry Commission then went around planting anywhere that it could. So one of my favourite sites, and a site which is I think it's probably one of the largest lowland raised mire recovery sites in the country, a spot called Falshaw Moss, very close to my heart. It's now been restored in a multi-million-pound project by Cumbria Wildlife Trust. But that was afforested by the Forestry Commission after Second World War. Prior to that, my grandfather actually, being the entrepreneurial individual that he was as a kid during the Second World War, used to go around collecting bilberries and also gull eggs to sell in Kendal during the war. But it was decided that it was superfluous. It wasn't really necessary and needed going forward. So therefore, you know, they drained it. They chucked a load of trees on it. Those trees didn't do very well. It was a real hodgepodge mix of, you know, Sitka spruce, lodgepole pine, western hemlock, etc. And they, yeah, and they basically, that was growing with trees until the early 2000s when Cumbria Wildlife Trust bought it and started to restore it. It was about the time it was notified as an SAC as well as part of the River Slack Mosses. And then now, yeah, it's probably one of the premier destinations for nature reserve destinations in South Cumbria. But you know, this planting on peat went on for a long time, and it wasn't until the Nature Conservancy took an existential stand against it under the steering of the late Derek Ratcliffe that it abated. It, you know, the Nature Conservancy fought tooth and nail to prevent the further planting up of the flow country. And this is where Terry came in, not particularly Terry, but you know, during the 1970s, there were quite a lot of tax breaks out there for people to plant trees, and you know, people were chucking trees on the flow country, etc. You know, to grow timber, but also, you know, to lessen their tax burden, and yeah, well, so the reason why I called it an existential stand as well by the Nature Conservancy was because the Nature Conservancy was disbanded after this. The Nature Conservancy won, but it was then split. You know, then and that was because it was going against government policy, etc. at the time, and they actually argued against it and successfully. And it's one of these stories that, yeah, okay, sometimes things do need you need to put the bigger picture in front of what you may perceive as being your needs. And yeah, without Derek Ratcliffe and the Nature Conservancy doing that back then, I don't think we would have as many undernuded sites, particularly in the far north of the country. So as I mentioned, you know, it was a multi-million-pound project to restore Falshaw Moss, and this is the same everywhere. You know, millions have been spent on harvesting this timber off these bogs. In the vast majority of time, it's poor quality. It costs more to actually harvest it than you will get back from it, and I would say probably most of it just went for pulp. So it ended up in toilet roll probably. And you know, we've already started that fight again. You know, we've got the quest now to plant God knows how many trees for climate change mitigation, and peat again is, you know, almost being viewed as fair game. And it's not, you know, it's not deep peat, it's shallow peat. But yeah, as I said, you know, is shallow peat any less good as deep peat? I'm not so certain. We'll come into that a bit later. So the other thing is yeah, peat cutting as well as a renewable fuel source. Yeah, okay, it's renewable at 1 millimetre a year, so yeah, it's a bit tongue in cheek that, obviously, but it's long been used as a fuel source. You go around any wetlands, any peatlands, etc., anywhere, and you will see that there's either the remains of peat cutting huts or peat cuttings actually within the peat mass. And you know, after we'd stripped the landscape of trees, people needed fuel to cook to keep warm during the winter, and then peat was actually, yeah, that's the next best thing. And the problem with peat cuttings is that, okay, yeah, you might be taking a little sliver out, like here, you know, this is on Kentry Moss up in Ardnamurchan, little chunk taken out. but actually that's fundamentally affecting the coherence and the hydrology of that bog. You know, it increases the hydraulic gradient. It means that water drains away quicker. And, you know, even this bog, I mean, I'll say this again later on as well, Kentra Bog is quite possibly the best bog I've ever walked over, but it still shows signs of impact, of human impact. And you know, people are still burning peat today. You know, we were up on holiday in Cannock, just round about the time, about a couple of weeks after the big fire that happened up there in Scotland. And you know, we're watching the helicopters taking buckets of water up to the hillside. My daughter absolutely loved it. And you know, we're chatting to the firemen last day, and one of the firemen openly said that, you know, they still cut and burn peat, you know, because it's cheap. You know, he's got a bit of peat moss, so he'll take the peat from it and keep on burning it. And I said, you're not worried that that's sort of like damaging and making things a bit drier? And he just went, you know, it's either that or I'm paying through the nose for gas or oil out here. And, you know, that's, yeah, pretty much a case in point. I could understand that. So, yeah, it's still a thing that goes on. I mean, in this country, I don't think we've ever burnt peat quite as ably as what the Irish have done. A lot of their bogs have been cut over for the industrial burning of peat for their power stations. You know, so you look at some of their bogs, and yeah, it is just an empty, flat, featureless black mess basically, because they've stripped everything off. I think they're getting better now, though. I think the last coal peat power stations are closing, and they're starting a big process of restoring their bogs, which is great. But then, yeah, this is the other issue as well that we have. So horticulture has been a massive user of peat in time. You know, entire bogs have been stripped. So, you know, Aunt Gladys can have some lovely petunias. And, you know, even now, you know, people are still complaining and moaning that the peat-free alternatives are not good enough, not as good as the peat compost. Despite the fact that, you know, it's just growing a few plants for your garden to look a little bit pretty. Do you actually need, you know, things to be absolutely perfect? I think people need to add a little bit of stochasticity into their lives and just accept it. It's but yeah, and you know, I've seen some of the bogs up in the north of Cumbria, for instance, Bolton Fell Moss. It was notified as extended and notified as an NNR in the it'd be early 2010s, I think it was. And the reason for that was to actually stop that peat mining process from going on there. The company that had it was bought out, and it's now being restored. And yeah, the people that were involved in that, like colleagues that I work with, like Deb Land, Alistair Brock, etc., have done some absolutely amazing things up there. It's truly inspirational to actually see what can actually happen in time if you create the space for nature to recover. But then, yeah, perhaps our biggest impact, this is a picture from the Lythe Valley in the Lake District, is agricultural reclamation. It's really interesting that we use that word reclamation, because I don't think we're reclaiming anything, are we? It's actually just claiming it. I don't think the word clamation is actually a word, though. I mean, we could coin it today if you want. I'll put a trademark on it. But yeah, most of our highly productive agricultural areas they are on peat, you know, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, etc. And these areas have been drained for a long time. And yeah, there are also places though where, you know, the agricultural output isn't as high, and you know, such places such as the Lythe Valley, for instance. And I'm putting my head on the line. I live just down the road from it. You know, they continue to be pumped at taxpayers' cost, and yet all they produce is grass and dairy, and dairy. And in the grand scheme of things, could they actually do things a bit different? Could we turn those pumps off? Could we start to restore those wetlands that were there once? I mean, there's a whole plethora of issues that are ongoing on that site. There should be, for instance, calcareous water flushing over the periphery of it. We've got two really large limestone scarps of Scout Scar and Whitbarrow Scar. But today, you go there and there's no hint or sign of that limestone influence that there would have been along the edge of these sites. It's all caught up in, like, for instance, in this image, this is the catch water that basically intercepts all that calcareous water and funnels it out into Morecambe Bay as quick as possible. And yeah, I think Chris actually has covered the conundrum of agriculture on Peatland quite eloquently in a LinkedIn post that he put out quite a few weeks ago. We do have to make choices, and we have to be pragmatic. And I think that, we do actually have to consider that we could try and push the impossible and look out of touch. People do need food, and that's not going to go away. And in some places, we may actually have to accept that we have to produce food in these places because we all need things to eat. But actually, then there's these other places which are more marginal, which are less productive. And I think these are the places where we can make real changes going forward. It's I think it's just a case of picking battles and choosing where we actually want to do things, and just accepting that, and accepting, okay, we might be making a decision which means that some peatlands will disappear in time or completely, that peat in the soil will disappear, but actually we can help it grow elsewhere. So where has this left us? Well, I mentioned it earlier, Raith Myers, we've lost an estimated 96% loss of their area. And everything else that's left it's heavily impacted, it's drained, it's cut, it's been planted. And even our best examples are missing parts of their morphology. So this is once again Kentra Moss up in Ardnamurchan, another place you should visit. Just visit Ardnamurchan, full stop. It's absolutely stunning. And this is quite possibly the best example of a lowland Resmire that I've ever seen. The hummock hollow topography was clear. I mean, this is what you're looking at now. It's this hummock and hollow topography that you find on a bog where the sphagnum grows up in time, and then in the gaps between where the sphagnum's growing up, you get water flowing. And this is just a transitional matrix of water, of sphagnum, of heather, of cladonia lichens, etc. And this was in April. The colours there are actually pretty vibrant. Not that my camera actually showed it. And but even here, where and this is the best example I've seen. Even here, there were impacts. There was no lag. I wandered around it. I found no lag. There's no rand. That's gone. That's all been cut off. There was rhododendron encroaching in. There was peat cuttings everywhere. There was drainage. A lot of the drainage was along the roads. I can understand why that's there. That basically what you're doing there is just creating separate hydroseas, separate hydrologies. So you're creating different bogs. It's could be a problem, but in the grand scheme of things, at least the rest of the bog is fine, or could be fine. So there's still some work to be done there. And the same sort of true of your blanket bogs as well, is that a lot of them have been drained. I've just seen a question coming up. Does this not look severely eroded? No, it doesn't. It keeps hold of the water, and you've got the sphagnum. Basically, it's in amongst the water. There, you've got quite a lot of sphagnum growing in amongst it as well. So it's what I mean. The pictures aren't great. Cameras on phones are great, but not that great. And it won't ever look severely eroded. It just looks like lawns and hummocks of sphagnum. So I was just saying about blanket peat. That's still drained. I mean, a lot of our grip systems, etc., to make more food for sheep to nibble during the summer and winter, or even for providing better food habitat for young grouse. So I remember when I was working for the Game Conservancy Trust, I think Game Wildlife Conservation Trust, back in 2007, we were up at the Lochindorb estate, and they were advocating mole ploughing the peatland there, just to drain it off a little bit. There was a big demonstration on as well of them doing it, and lots of gamekeepers stroking their chins, going, "Oh right, yeah." And I was just thinking, this is sort of damaging a peat bog. What's going on here? But anyway, so. And that's that still goes on today. There are still people draining peat. There's still people mole gripping it, etc., just so they can get an extra bite out for their sheep, an extra couple of mouths to feed on different bits. So how do we put this right? Once again, Chris has been working his magic with his little infographics here. So fundamentally, you just make these sites wetter. It is a little bit more nuanced. It's not that much more nuanced, But if you can make a peat bog wet, then that peat bog's going to start accreting. It's going to get better, and it's about restoring the hydraulic gradients within the peat. So, I mean, we have tried some incredibly interesting stuff. So, if you look through books and stuff like that, with people advocating putting in visqueen sheets around the edge of bogs, so basically keeping that water trapped into that bog, so therefore it could never get out, but it would keep that bog wet. And I think this was down to a misunderstanding of what we knew about bogs and how they actually function. That, you know, bogs do hold on to water, but they do also release it. The water does flow out in time. You know, the peat itself isn't a full aquitard. So one of the ways to, like, really, if you've got a peatland site and it's damaged, let's say it's been planted with trees, well, the first thing that you've got to do is glow that canopy, get rid of those trees. So, you know, those trees are fundamentally damaging to bogs, or can be fundamentally damaged. They are also a natural part of bogs as well. So in this country, we tend to have this feeling and this understanding that trees perhaps aren't part of bogs landscapes. But if you go anywhere, Estonia, for instance, there are trees all over these bogs. They're growing on the land, on the lag, they're growing on the rand, etc. We don't really have that. I think that's probably because we've lost a lot of our rand, we've lost a lot of our lag. We don't really see that interaction. Equally, we just don't have those massive wetland complexes anymore that, like, they do have up in the Baltic states, and which is a shame. We could have them. It'd be a massively wonderful project to be involved in restoring something like that. But yeah, you get rid of the trees, or you make it wet enough to get rid of the trees. And this has always been the first thing to do. And one of the great weird things about it is that trees, they stop rain from hitting the ground. So if you've got an unintended wetland, the only way that they get that any water in it is coming from rainfall. Trees will intercept it, and then they will also evapotranspirate it out of the ground, which causes problems. It dries out that peat, dries out the root layer. It allows other plants in, such as Molinia caerulea, purple myrgrass. Purple myrgrass is a fantastically adaptable species of grass. It does like wet feet, but it doesn't like feet too wet. And in the height of summer, Molinia caerulea actually has an evapotranspiration rate, which is broadly similar to that of a birch tree. So you think about, if you've got birch trees and you've got Molinia, you are sucking out quite a lot of water out of that peat mass. So what you want to try and do is just get rid of those trees, or at the first instance, and try and reduce that rate of loss and interception. But this is really costly. You know, it's not cheap. You need specialized kit. You need low ground pressure kit. You need to. Yeah, sometimes you need to use zip lines, etc. Like, people have used helicopters to get trees off bogs because it's just so difficult to get it off. And that timber, by the time you've actually done all that, there's no economic benefit from it. You know, you've spent more money actually extracting that timber. But once you've done that, I mean, another way of doing it is actually bunding through the trees, and I'll maybe discuss that in the next section. Is that you raise that water table. So this is some of the stuff that I've worked on personally in the past. So this is Russell and Moss in the Lake District. And so over time, actually, we learned that bogs have water flowing through them. As the water flows through them, it's how bogs can become very regulating within a landscape. But that flow of water is exceptionally slow. It's really slow, you know. And as I said, that catatomic peat, it's not like a full aquitard like clay, so it doesn't absolutely stop the movement of water through it, but it does allow that flow to come through. So what you're actually doing when you're using peat to actually raise the water table by putting in bunds, by putting in ditch blocks, is that you're actually maintaining that natural process of that water through the site, but actually. Yeah, so you're not fully retarding it. And yeah, using peat's actually a really cheap way of doing it. So if you've got good quality peat, you've got the depth of peat. You don't have to bring anything onto site. It's all there, you know. It's under the ground, and yeah, okay, there are potentially issues with that. You know, I've had it leveled at me that I'm damaging the stratigraphic integrity of the bog, and therefore damaging any sort of pollen analysis that could be done into the future. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's probably true in those areas where you're putting in the bunds and where you're putting in the digging out the borrow pits, but actually, the vast majority of the site you're not touching, and it's perhaps not as touched as the original, like so on this site at Russland. It's part of the site. It's called Haybridge Moss. Somebody in their infinite wisdom had decided to put in a full herringbone drainage pattern. I mean, that's got to be more damaging than actually going ahead and restoring it. Yeah, so this was quite a funny bund. It was massive. It was absolutely huge. I think it was one of the lads who was working on it, his like first job, like working with the company. And they were, the boss came along and looked at it. He wanted to show me it and just apologise. I said, no, it's it's good. At least it's going to hold back somewhat. But I mean, this actually is really good. It shows the Boris Pit and it shows the structure as well. So these are Boris pits. You take them every now and again. You dig a hole, dig a trench. Well, remove the vegetation. You dig the trench, or you smash up a lot of the peat that was under there. So if it was damaged, put some good peat in, and then basically then you lay the vegetation over the top. Towards the end of it, I mean, as I said, Alistair Brock, he was a senior advisor or manager, I can't remember what they called him, up in the north of the Lake District, who did a lot of the pioneering work on actually developing this sort of technique. And yeah, in discussions, we even got it down to as high, you just needed a bund as high as 20 centimeters. The majority of the structure is at surface level and below. This stuff on the top is just basically there to help protect it. But yeah, you just basically stick the vegetation over the top. And yeah, it works. It holds back water. The problem, and you see this all over, is that the bigger the bund, the more water that you hold up back, the bigger the cell that you potentially got, which then brings in the problems of wave action. Sphagnum hates wave action. So you end up with large areas of open water for a long, long time. And that's not what you want. You don't want to actually create big pools of water when you're doing peat restoration. What you want to create is keep that water at or near the surface. I think that's one of the biggest misnomers of peat restoration, is like you see a lot of places and they've got, big lakes. It looks like a load of paddy fields. You don't really want that. That's too deep. You just want that water to be kept at or near the surface. Make those conditions right as you can for the sphagnum moss and the greater diversity of sphagnum mosses, not just the, if you've got big areas of open water, you're probably limiting yourself to sphagnum cuspidatum. That's one type of moss, and it takes a long time for it to actually take over the bigger areas of moss, because it can grow really well. Most of the time it doesn't. And this is using bunding to go across a lowland raised mire site. You can actually use the same principle to restore meal and grips as well. So you're just basically taking out little chunks like borrow pits, sticking that in the ground, and then putting your cap of vegetation over the top. Move on to your next block, 10, 15 meters or wherever it is further up that grip. It's great, like, as I say, you don't have to bring any material on. You just have to get really, really clever, crazy guys in on machines to come in and actually do that work. And there's a lot of companies out there that used a few, and they're all really, really good and really competent. Like some of the stuff that they can do and the fine detail. I suppose any excavator driver that you see in that, the way that they treat the arm and that bucket of their machine, it's almost like an extension of their own arm, is great. So as I said, there are alternatives to peat. Stone, wood and plastic, they have been used and they all have their places. I've historically not really had much use of stone, wood or plastic. I've always tried to stick with the peat as best I can. And the main problem for me with this is that bringing stuff in is expensive. Most of our wetland sites and peatland sites are, they're a long way away from anywhere. You have to use helicopters to bring stuff in. Stone's heavy. So and it can cost a lot more money and really, really ramp up the price of your restoration. So if you've got good enough peat, just try and use peat as best you can. This bottom image here was the result of me having a conversation in a farmer's farmhouse one day, and we were just talking about the bog just up the hill at Mosedale, and I said, oh, it'd be really nice for you to block that up with a bit of stone. And then about a week later, I get this phone call. He goes, oh, can you pop down and have a look at this? So I came down. He'd just gone ahead and done this himself. The structure's still there now today. The bog's a hell of a lot wetter because of it. And he just went out and did this. And it was just like, all right, this is great. Yeah, there are potentially fish movement issues there. Yeah, it's a big sort of like weir that he's installed in. Fortunately, there's a part, I think it's about a 30-foot waterfall just down from it, so I'm a bit fairly sanguine about any fish movement issues on it. But yeah, it's funny how sometimes you can have a conversation with somebody and they will be inspired to just go out and get their digger out and then start playing around. Equally, I think he was just a bit bored. What's the net result of this? Once you've reduced the hydraulic gradient effect of edges, anything up to 15 meters can be affected by any edge work that goes on, be that ditches, by peat cuttings, etc. And you're keeping that water table high and stable. This allows your bog vegetation to proliferate. It allows carbon to sequester and your water to drain more slowly. And that means you've got a really happy peatland, and it starts to look like this. Bit more colour. I think there's sphagnum magellanicum growing in there, and some sphagnum papillosum as well, which is just really nice to see. This was Kendra moss as well. I've spent a long time. I'd heard that there was sphagnum athene on there, which is one of the indicators of really nice unintended sites. I didn't find any, but I've seemingly looking in the wrong place. But yeah, spent spent pretty much a morning in the rain looking for bog mosses. My wife and daughter decided to stay back at the holiday cottage whilst I did that, for obvious reasons. So this, like, one of the way that Ecology has been helping as well is that we've partnered with the Lost Peatlands project in Wales, and they've been doing a large amount of work on conifer removal, restoring damaging drainage, etc. And then they've been supplementing the sites with sphagnum that's been grown by the I think it's the Celtic wildflower company, and what that does is that just speeds that process of sphagnum proliferation within the Maya site, meaning that you will hopefully sooner, rather than having to wait 30 years, you might have to wait 25 or 20 years for it to recover. And then yeah, so this has been a real good site, and this is like part of the team. We all went, well, I say we all went out. I didn't go out on this, so everybody else went out in the sopping rain to go out and restore this site. And I think they've had a really good time. It's just really nice to actually partner with such a pioneering project as well. And this is what you win. You get, first of all, your peatlands fixed, and it's it's sequestering that carbon. Your biodiversity is improving, but everything else that's around it that lives on it or is around the peat is that little bit happier. And you also help everybody downstream as well. And I think this is the crux to me of peatland restoration. It's not just the site that you're restoring that it helps everyone, like particularly downstream. It helps to regulate water flows, so like even so reduces the peaks during the flashiness of winter rains, etc., flooding, but it also helps regulate that water that's released from the landscape during the summer, so it helps prevent drought and helps prevent our rivers from drying up, and also helps water companies provide cleaner water. Getting rid of dissolved organic carbon from drinking water, it's ridiculously expensive. The more pristine your bog, the less DOC that's actually released in that water, the cheaper it is for them to actually deal with as well. So thinking about bog restoration as well is, I've always done it. It's how we've always done it. We've always worked in the winter, and the more I think about it, is that why do we always just do this bog restoration in the winter? And I think the perceived wisdom was that it helps breeding birds. You're not disturbing breeding birds. But the more I think about it, the more I think, well, the Rhinoceros, they have many different seasons where they get to breed. Different years. So stopping them from breeding for a single season isn't necessarily a problem. In my understanding of birds and an experience of birds is that if you've got machines working in an area and they pass through it, as long as they've still got time to breed, they'll breed, and they'll breed on that site. But yeah, if you drown a hibernating toad, a hibernating lizard, a hibernating adder, etc., that's in a bit of the wet site, then that's gone. You know, you don't get that back. So is this something we can get better at? Do we actually start after thinking about, you know, applying for licenses? If this is a licensing issue for breeding birds, you know, can we get better at it? Can we actually start thinking, okay, what's the actual loss going to be to other stuff, to other species? And then this also then brings me onto the Peatland Code. And my biggest challenge and problem that I have with the Peatland Code is the fact that it's only bothered about deep peat. And given that most of our peatlands have been lost, and you're typically left with this smear of peaty soil that's around our peatland sites, then the vast majority of projects, you know, they won't be funded under this Peatland Code. They won't be funded, but they won't be validated. I don't necessarily think that that's a good thing. And I view this as almost this typical challenge that we have of conservation over nature recovery, i.e. you protect small bits, but actually the rest of it's allowed to fall away. And it's and you're also preventing those macro-ecological processes from taking place. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a force for good, but it's the way that it treats shallow peat. And this is my last slide. Sorry, Chris, I know I've gone over. So how does the code help us with nature recovery? As I said, I just don't think it does. It doesn't protect the system. It protects the deep peat, and it starts to create these two-tiered sites, you know, so you'll have the eligible and not eligible. And that leads to unintended consequences. So the biggest one that I can think of is the unintended consequence of the SSI and how that's actually played out in reality. So SSIs, when they were created, they were meant to be the best, you know, the best of the best, you know, the best within the area of search. So you protected them, but you maintained all the other nice bits of habitat around. What actually ended up was the stuff that was protected and everything else was damaged. It was got rid of, which then led to massive areas of biodiversity loss. So you're basically then left with much denuded system and much denuded nature of your landscapes. And I think that actually what you need is a funding system that values the functioning of the ecosystem and not its products. So, you know, at the minute, Peatland Code is basically just about helping getting people to pay for carbon. It doesn't get to pay for that whole ecosystem. You know, for instance, you know, you could give your peatland site, which is all deep peat protected within the funded by the Peatland Code, but all that stuff that's around it, you know, the bits where the bog can move into, the bits that were bog that have been since destroyed, and because it doesn't fit that target of, I think it's 30 centimeters, somebody can come along and plant trees on it. You know, the UK forestry standard allows you to plant trees on it, and it's not even EIA-able because it's shallow peat. I mean, it's an absolute nonsense. And I think that, you know, until we actually get better at recognizing that our habitats are part of functioning ecosystems and are part of functioning processes, then we are constantly going to be fighting battles of loss and having the same old arguments. And it just would be wonderful at some point to actually draw a line under these arguments and say, no, we're protecting the system. Let's go. Let's go for that. And there are ways and means for us to do that. I think coming to the fore. So Credit Nature, our sister company, for instance, they've developed a network and a framework of trying to fund ecosystem coherence and ecosystem management rather than funding the products of biodiversity and carbon, which is something to really look, which is really exciting. It's almost hitting the sweet spot of exactly where I think nature recovery should be going. And that's that. That's me. I'm done. I'm over time. I'm sorry. Yeah, Chris, now it's time for you to answer the questions.
No problem. Thanks, Matt. I thought I'd let you keep going because you're on a roll there, and people seem to be really enjoying what you were talking about. I didn't want to interrupt right in the middle of your spiel. Yeah, so there's been a lot of different questions. I think what might make sense is this session is going to be recorded, so we'll run over slightly. So if you need to dash away, just bear in mind it's going to be recorded. We'll send you the recording afterwards. So we'll do about 10 minutes worth of questions, and then if you need to watch it back, you can watch it back. I'll go through. I might condense some of these questions as well because we had so many. There are a few about climate change, specifically how climate change is going to affect peatland in the future, and how you think interventions need to be designed in order to kind of cope with it, or how do you think, whether you think these habitats actually need to be, our attitudes need to shift towards these habitats, whether these habitats are sort of inevitably going to be changing because the tree line is going to be shifting upwards.
Good questions. I think it's going to vary where you are in the country. So the places, the people parts into the east of the country. So I'm talking like Lincolnshire, etc. They're already getting much drier. The Humberhead levels, for instance, they've got quite serious and quite big issues with regards to getting the amount of water that they actually need on there now. And it's, I think in time, the vast majority of our peatlands are probably going to love it. It's going to get wetter. It's going to get warmer. It's going to get wetter. That increases the growing season for sphagnum. So therefore, yeah, I can imagine that they'll love it. But those places where it's drier, sphagnum's going to struggle. And without that constant rainfall, then you're starting to lose those abiotic factors, which makes this the climax community, and you probably would then start to get more trees coming in. I think the upland side of things, depending where you are in the country, most of it's going to be wetter as well, the higher you get up as well. So I can imagine that'll I could imagine that'll all start to probably still be in balance, and perhaps the peatlands there will actually expand. I mean, that's what we've seen historically. Our peatlands in the uplands, the blanket bogs, etc. They've not been there for longer than 5,000 years. Trees were the climax community. They've then been succeeded by your bogs. So yeah, I think that might happen.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
And I've got a question here about solar and wind farms. What do you think, if there's any merit on setting them up on peat bogs which have been degraded? Could the peat bog be degraded at the same time as a wind farm or solar farm is being set up?
Oh, I don't know. There's challenges, wind farms, for instance. There's a lot of wind farms gone up in Scotland on peatland sites. They have their challenges. You're creating lots of lenses of peat rather than, you're removing that hydrological continuity because you're having to put tracks in to get to them, which means that you need somewhere that's drier, which means that you've got more areas of drainage. Equally, you could restore it. Solar farms, I don't know why you'd want to put a solar farm up north. It's dark pretty much all winter, and I think solar farms, personally, I think solar's better on our built environment rather than putting it into the wider landscape. That's personal opinion. Sorry, it hasn't really answered your question, but that's.
What about? There's a few questions about timelines. How long a typical peatland restoration would be likely to take? I guess both in terms of the intervention and in terms of what kind of results you would see.
I think back to Falshaw Moss. So that was the first one that I was involved with. Falshaw Moss, that started in 2001 when they got the site. I think it was, it might have been 98 actually when they got the site. But yeah, the first trees came off in 2001. And I think they finished in, I think it was 2014, 2015. I mean, you could argue that there's still stuff to do there. There's bits that, that adjacent landowners own that they just still don't want. So you've had to put sort of like countermeasures in a way, sort of, to prevent any issues, so you've not been able to. But yeah, it can take, if best will of the world, you'd love to get 100 machines on a site and get it all done in 1 year, and then just let it go. And then you're talking anything up to 30 years for that bog to be considered a fully functioning bog again. That's without any further problems being thrown up in the interim.
And Haley asks whether any changes need to be made to restoring peat. You touched on the Peatland Code. What kind of suggestions would you have for government policy and government funding beyond what not to do, but also sort of what could be done?
Yeah, I think it's this whole thing of looking at the actual system and funding the lot. So not just saying that you're only going to get your credits for this thing. And I understand that, they've got to draw lines somewhere. And there's been a hell of a lot of lobbying from different places about different things. And it just, the shallow peat area, if you look at it, it's where everybody wants to grow trees because it's got less agricultural value, etc. And so if they're not allowed to plant on shallow peat and they're not allowed to plant on deep peat, then where do you then plant? You know, it's that kind of a question. I think things just need to be a little bit more joined up, and then maybe we have to accept that parts of our landscape will be forestry. You know, that's got to be. But equally, what we've also got to accept is that where you've got opportunities for really nice landscape scale peatland restoration, let's run with it and let's fund the lot and not say, oh no, we're not funding this bit, you're gonna have to go to somebody else. I think it's just, yeah, having that opportunity to actually restore peat over a landscape would be absolutely wonderful, I think. And yeah, getting everything restored in it as well, the full functionality.
That's great. There are also some questions about failures, which people are quite interested in learning from mistakes. So I guess you touched on the kind of the very high bund earlier, but were there any other kind of case studies of failures in restoration?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found with plastic piling, for instance, is that where you put plastic piling in by itself, you can, because of the way that our weather works, you know, you have dry periods, i.e. the summer, then you have your wetter period during the winter. It sounds a bit moot up here in the Lake District where it's just wet all the time, but there are subtle differences. And what we found with plastic piling was that you end up with hydraulic pressure. So the weight of water that builds up during the winter stacks up one way, and then as it's released, the pressure releases. So then that you start to get this slow movement of the plastic piling within the peat mass. And over time, what that does, it then creates a gap, which the water likes to find gaps and leak away. And then it goes round your plastic piling. You turn up one day and you've got no water left in your plastic, within your ditch, because it's literally because of that pressure release over time, it's all released out, which is why we started to think outside the box and let's start using peat. It's very rare that you actually see that. So yeah, that's one of them. For failures,
I mean that's great. I'll just there's just one. I think we'll have time for just one more quick one, which I actually saw pop up in here. Where since I've written down the questions, which is about beavers, and I don't think I'd caught you talking about beavers, but of course it's a rewilding presentation, so maybe you could bring in beavers somewhere. What's your take on beavers and how they have a role in this?
I think beavers as part of a wetland system would absolutely have a role in something, but whether I'd like to employ them for bog restoration, I don't know. I mean, you've not got the food for them, so you know, particularly in the way our bog landscapes are at present. But yeah, of course, I think, you know, a lot of our wetlands and a lot of our wetland communities will have come from, you know, they would have been found within beaver wetlands. Beavers do perform the same sort of like trick of backing water up. So yeah, I think you could use it definitely for your minotrophic wetland sites. Probably not so good for your ombrotrophic sites.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. It was a pleasure to listen to that presentation today. So interesting. I've got so many notes, little things which come up, little things like grips. I didn't realize they were called grips in Somerset. They're called gripes. So yeah, just amazing. I'm sure everyone else enjoyed it too. I've seen lots of comments saying how much they enjoyed the presentation.